Hello, I'm Amy Comstock Rick, the President and CEO of the Food and Drug Law Institute, and it is my great pleasure to be in a conversation with Dr. Peter Marks, the Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, otherwise known as CBER at FDA, which oversees biological products, including vaccines. I won't go over Peter's entire biography. I hope you look at it on your own, but Peter has worked both in industry and academic medicine before coming to FDA 9 years ago when he joined as CBER deputy and he became director in 2016. So welcome, Peter. It's nice to see you.
Thanks so much for having me today.
So let's get right to it. We don't have a lot of time together. As we've discussed, many Americans in the last year have learned there is a difference between an emergency use authorization and full approval, in this case, of course, for the COVID-19 vaccine. Can you shed some light on the difference between the two?
Yeah, thanks for that question. A biologics license application is how vaccines are normally approved, and that uses our normal standard for approval that the products are safe, pure, and potent, and that there has been a demonstration of effectiveness from an adequate and well-controlled trials. Usually those trials involve something on the order of 20,000 or so vaccinated people for the average vaccine that's approved in the United States. The Emergency Use Authorization Authority is something that was given to us after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in order to allow medical countermeasures to be deployed in public health emergencies when they're declared, such as the one we're in now, when things could potentially be helpful but hadn't made it all the way through development, and there wasn't some approved or available alternative that could be used to treat a condition. So basically trying to make something available to help people. Now, we at that standard there is a lower standard, one of something that may be effective and that known potential benefits outweigh the known potential risks. We very much upfront when we were designing our development programs for vaccines noted that healthy people would probably want something that was a little bit higher in terms of a standard. And so we, in our guidance, put forward that we would expect the trial sizes for these vaccines that would be authorized under emergency use for COVID-19 to be like the size of those for a biologics license application. In other words, involving close to or somewhere around the range of 20,000 vaccinated individuals. And that we also noted that we want to see some minimum amount of follow-up, which in this case we picked a median of 2 months because most of the side effects show up to vaccination within a period of about 42 days after vaccination, and a median of 2 months gave us a little cushion there. So those things combined with having good post-market surveillance made us feel comfortable that although there is a difference, there's some differences in the amount of manufacturing information and the length of safety follow-up. In the case of vaccines, the size of the trials are very similar. And really, for the emergency use authorized vaccines, there was a clear and compelling demonstration of safety and effectiveness from these large trials.
So can you help me understand, the EUAs were December of 2020, and the Pfizer BioNTech approval was just in August, and we're still awaiting Moderna. Kind of what took so long? What data gave you such confidence to give an EUA, but it takes 8-9 more months to get the approval?
Right. Thanks. So there are a couple different aspects of that. They have to do with manufacturing, safety, and maturing effectiveness data. So let's start with the manufacturing. For emergency use authorization, we're granted a fair amount of latitude in what we can do in terms of making a product available. But for a license, we have to have multiple conformance lots. Those means that the manufacturer has to be able to show they can make the thing over and over again in the same manner. And we inspect all the facilities that are being used for production of the product. And that actually, in the case of a pandemic, for a product that's being made in millions and millions of doses in multiple sites, takes a little time to do. When we move, we also have something called lot release, where we go through and make sure that the product is what it says it is. That also has to be put in place. before we approve a product. So all of those things had to be taken care of. From the safety perspective, I told you we had a median of 2 months of follow-up when we did the emergency use authorization. We like to license vaccines after we have more like 6 months of safety follow-up. And for the Pfizer BioNTech, for their biologics license application, we had that we waited after a period where we had data on 12,000 individuals who had been followed for at least 6 months. So that gave us a more robust safety data set. And then in terms of effectiveness, we had a larger effectiveness data set instead of just data on cases that occurred in about, I think it was about 170 individuals for the emergency use authorization. We had data on 900 cases and were able to see the essentially durability over time for this. So a bunch of things together. Ultimately, the difference practically, tens of thousands of pages for an emergency use authorization, hundreds of thousands of pages, I think roughly 300,000 page equivalents for the biologics license application. A lot more to get through. And FDA is one of the few regulatory agencies globally that actually goes through patient level data, and we do our own analyses. We don't just look at summary data, so it does take some time to get through it all.
So I'm intrigued by the manufacturing, the additional level of manufacturing inspections. Were they all remote worldwide? Domestically, were some of those in person?
So some of those, in some cases, we might have relied on inspectional history and desk audits. In other words, somewhat looking at data. But we actually sent teams into places both in the United States and internationally when we needed to do inspections. And we're very grateful that those people were willing to take risk, even though they may or may not have been vaccinated. They took risk going in and doing those inspections. So that was an important part of getting this done.
Yeah, we all know FDA, your team has been performing at a Herculean level, no question. Is there anything in that span of time, that 8 or 9 months between the EUA and then the full approval or receiving the BLA from Moderna, that surprised you, that you learned either about the vaccine or about its shelf life, just something that gave you pause?
Nothing really. I don't think there were any big surprises in that period with the Pfizer vaccine. I do think there were some interesting things that did give me, I kind of have a new attitude towards vaccine rollouts because, very shortly, just as Pfizer is starting to roll out, we had these allergic reactions, and there were a couple of days there when we had these anaphylactic reactions, when each day felt like it was a roller coaster. People may recall that there was a mass vaccination site where there was essentially almost hysteria broke out because of these. But, we worked through that by putting essentially mitigation strategies in place of asking people had they had allergic reactions to prior injections or prior medications, and by having the observation period of a half an hour for certain people, and by having treatments for severe allergic reactions available on site. That rate has gone away, and really now the rate is known to be somewhere on the order of 1 in 300,000 individuals. So these vaccine rollouts, I've said it before, they are not for the faint of heart. I think that was clearly a key learning. And obviously there are some other safety signals that we've been looking after that we have to continue to follow up. One is this issue of possible myocarditis. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle that has been seen with the mRNA vaccines, mostly in men under the age of 30. The rate is somewhere on the order of 1 in 5,000, 1 in 10,000. But the lucky thing about this to date is that the rate of anything that's been considered like significant, in other words, things that really require more intensive care rather than just observation in the hospital and discharge after 24 hours, is the rate's about 1 in 250,000. So I'm not saying that we're not concerned about this. We obviously are going to continue to work to make sure we keep a close eye on this issue of myocarditis. But it's one of those things that it comes along with the territory of doing a vaccine rollout, that there can be side effects. And here we think it may be related to the degree of inflammation that's occurring. But thankfully, in 98% of those who get myocarditis from this vaccine, it turns out to be very mild or relatively mild. And really, the treatment is generally just a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs.
So one of the things that, again, a level of detail you didn't think people in the public would be talking about, but the EUA data and the trials were done on the Alpha variant, as I understand it. Now, of course, we all know we're dealing significantly with the Delta variant. How can you take the data from one and apply it to the other? And then my much more direct question is the virus mutating faster than FDA can keep up? How will you keep dealing with different mutations and variants?
Great questions, both. So first of all, we're lucky enough to know now that the titers of antibodies, the amount of antibodies that our bodies make against the spike protein on the surface of coronavirus, that's the main thing that we make our immune response to on the surface of the virus. Those antibody levels can be measured. They can be used in assays against the different coronavirus variants to see how well we're going to be able to fight them off. And the lucky thing is that the current vaccines do a pretty good job against the Delta variant. And that is, we know that from the laboratory studies, but we also now know that from field studies where in the real world, we can see that the current generation of vaccines is taking care of the Delta variant. There's very clear evidence that that is the case, some of that coming out of Israel, some of that coming out of other places around the globe, including the United States. So we are confident that the current vaccines are able to address the Delta variant, particularly within the first number of months after they're vaccinated. The reason why we may get to a conversation about boosters is because as immunity wanes a little bit, it may not be as easy to deal with that Delta variant in terms of some forms of COVID. Now, the question that you ask about how do we deal with the next variant, and this is really hard. I never was good with my Greek alphabet, and now we're up to mu, and then we have nu, and then I think it's after that I'll have to look it up. But eventually we're going to have omega, and then we'll go back and have double Greek letters. The good news is something that we have been able to work through is how we're going to address these in the future. And I think we have a good enough paradigm with the mRNA vaccines that we're going to be facile in being able to switch over if we ever have to. If this ever kind of strays far enough that the current generation of vaccines are not able to produce good immune responses, we have a plan forward whereby we probably, with these vaccines, can switch over in a matter of weeks to a few months to a new vaccine strain, rather than having to wait months and months. And that's because we are not going to need the kind of large clinical trials that we needed up front. We'll need a much smaller amount of data to be able to make this switch to address these variants if they come along.
So let's keep talking about boosters or third shots. There's a lot of talk about them. There's a lot of interest. I understand some people have gone ahead and gotten them, even if they're not in the severely immune compromised category, if you will. Quite frankly, I can't help but ask this question because the last couple of years, is the FDA under pressure to approve booster shots, regardless of what the advisory committee might say? I know a week from, I think later this week, or what the science says?
Now, there's no political pressure here. There is our own scientific interest in making sure we get it right. To back it up a little bit, let's just think about how this vaccine was developed. This was developed on the fly, and most vaccines in adults, if you think about it, oftentimes we give vaccines several months apart to get a really good immune response. That's what gives you a mature immune response. It's how, if you're an adult and you've ever been vaccinated for hepatitis B, you'll realize you went back, you might have gotten 3 shots, one at 0, one week, one couple weeks later, and then a third at 6 months. That's how you get a mature immune response. So it may just be what we're doing here is making sure that we get a good, robust immune response. And there's evidence emerging that that's the case. So it may be, rather than calling these boosters, these may really ultimately, and only time will prove me right or wrong, these may ultimately be just the third dose or the second dose in the case of one of the vaccines, the second or third dose in the primary series. And we have to make sure that we are doing the right thing here in protecting our population. We don't want to see people starting to get sick again from COVID-19 after a number of months and needing to get hospitalized. And that's what triggered this. What triggered this was that in Israel, which was about a month or so ahead of us, and they also not only were they a month ahead of us in their vaccination campaign, the slope, the number of people they vaccinated was very rapid. So they had a lot of people vaccinated very early. And when they saw a waning of immunity in their population and a need for boosters, that triggered a lot of this conversation. And it shouldn't be all that surprising, in this setting, particularly because Delta variant may need a very robust antibody response to protect against it. So that combination of kind of a waning immunity and the Delta variant is what has led us to need to consider this need for boosters or third doses. And we will follow the science to make sure that we do the right thing here. I mean, you can take this two ways. There's, and I will acknowledge there's an international dialogue about whether third doses should be given before everyone's vaccinated or not. And it's a very valid conversation, but we have to separate the political and the scientific, because there's a political decision that can be made about whether you think it's right to get everyone vaccinated across the globe before people get the third dose. On the other hand, there is a scientific issue of what is the right thing to do to maximally protect against further circulation of COVID-19. And one can think that if one does not adequately deal with this in the population, we could end up with unwittingly facilitating getting to that Omega variant more quickly. So that's our internal drive here. Is that we want to bring this pandemic to an end as rapidly as possible and save as many American lives as we possibly can. And so that is what drives us to want to get to a decision here as quickly as possible, because there are data suggests that if you need a third dose, it's probably better to get there sooner and deploy it rather than when it's really clear that people are starting to have severe illness. And the final piece of this that's really important is that breakthrough infections against vaccines create issues with vaccine confidence. And I don't know, I hope I'm not breaking news in the United States. We have a vaccine confidence problem in this country, and we don't need to exacerbate it any further. And so just like you hear people who lose confidence in the flu shot because, oh, I got the flu shot, but I got the flu. It's true, because the flu shot's only 50 or 60% effective, even on a good year. For the COVID-19 vaccines, these have been very effective, but we don't need breakthrough infections making people feel like it's not worth continuing to get vaccinated against COVID-19.
We definitely have a vaccine confidence issue in this country. I think we only have a couple more minutes, but I do want to talk about children. One thing that I understand to be true is that once the vaccine was approved, doctors can prescribe it off label. And I know there's so much focus on getting our under 12 population vaccinated. First off, do you have any insight on the timeline for that? And second, are you concerned about, or are you seeing doctors prescribing or giving the booster to children under 12 because they legally can now, as I understand it?
There's some complexity here, legal complexity about liability protection for giving it under age 12. I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to say the following. We do know from one of the manufacturers that they intend to get us their data by the end of September. We intend to look at those data, evaluate them as rapidly as we can, doing a thorough job so that if we make that vaccine available under emergency use authorization, we are confident that anyone's child, including our own, will be able to get that vaccine if they're in the 5 to 11 age group. There is difference here because they're not just getting the same old dose as a 12 and up person will. They have to get a reduced dose. And that's why it's not a good idea for doctors to take things in their own hands at this point, because the right dose needs to be given. We don't want children to have adverse effects. Granted, we want them to be able to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, but let's do it right.
Absolutely. Let's talk about you and your colleagues for a minute. It's been a long 18 months, for longer than that, I guess, for FDA. How is everyone doing? And quite frankly, what are you doing to hang in there? We know you're working so hard. Your head remains clear. How are you doing it? The news talks about Tony Fauci taking long walks, and we all know Francis Collins and his guitar. What does Peter Marks do?
Well, let me start by saying we have an incredible group of people who have maintained incredible stamina through this time. It has been very challenging. It has been a very long 18 plus months now. I'm going to be encouraging as we get into the late fall months. I'm going to try to make sure that our folks really enforce trying to get them to take some time off around holidays this year, because people do need to rejuvenate. This has taken a toll on people. For me, I feel lucky. I've developed routines that help keep me sane and keep me at least level-minded. I have kind of a daily routine. I start my day by a long walk with my dog, and I end my day with a long walk with my dog. My dog essentially is essentially a little bit of a therapeutic modality for me, and that is incredibly helpful.
Good. It is my sense that your job and the role of FDA really has changed through the pandemic, and there's more focus on public communication and education than there may have been historically for what is a scientific agency. How has all this changed your day-to-day job?
That's a great question. I think it has forced the focus on communications has just made it very clear to me how important transparency is in what we do, making sure that what we communicate is in plain language that's understandable, and it's helped me focus on that ever more in how I go about my work. So it has changed us into an agency where there is increased focus on that word transparency, increased focus on transparency, not just through posting documents, but also by using language that people can understand, to understand the concepts, to grip the concepts that we're trying to bring forward.
Is there more you think FDA can do to tackle this vaccine confidence problem we have in the country, or do you think the transparency is really the key and everything you can do?
Yeah, well, we're trying our best by making sure it's transparent that we're doing all of our normal reviews, that what we are doing here, these vaccines are safe and effective, that there are no corners being cut. We're trying to make sure that's very clear. We're continuing to try to get out there in the public as much as we can. I kind of have a spare time hobby of trying to do evening webinars with various groups, some vaccine hesitant groups when on occasion, to try to answer questions. That's, I think that's what we can do here. We're trying our best to make sure that we do our part to make sure that people know that these vaccines are things that we have confidence in, and we hope they'll have confidence in.
Thank you. And with that, Dr. Marks, I, on behalf of everyone who's listening to this, but as well as my own family, want to thank you for all the hard work you're doing, and we certainly appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me today.